Each of us ought to avoid emitting greenhouse gas. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. We have a moral duty not to harm other people, and particularly not to harm other people for our own benefit. And when we emit greenhouse gas, that's exactly what we do. We're generally doing it for our own benefit, and the gas we emit spreads around the world and does little bits of harm all over the world and for a very long time. So we're doing harm generally for our own benefit, and we ought not to do it. Now that's not much of an argument, and you're likely not to be convinced just by that. But one of the things you could say is, well, there is a rule that says you're not to harm, especially not for your own benefit. But there are obvious exceptions to it. So you might harm in self-defense, for example. And of course you're not doing that when you emit greenhouse gas, so that exception doesn't apply. But you might think, well, here's another exception. It's okay to do trivial harms. We accept people doing trivial harms to each other, and maybe emission of greenhouse gas falls under that exception. But actually, I think that's just not true. When you emit greenhouse gas, it only does a very little bit of harm to each other person in the world, but it does do harm to everybody in the world, and everybody, indeed, who's going to be living for the next 100 or 200 years. And when you add it up, the harm you do actually comes to something pretty significant. By my calculation, most of us, during our lifetime, will emit enough greenhouse gas to shorten lives, other people's lives, in total by some months. And shortening life by some months, that's by no means a trivial thing to do. So emitting greenhouse gas doesn't fall under the triviality exception, and so far as I can see, it doesn't fall under any other exception either to the rule that we ought not to do harm. So I conclude that that's true. None of us ought to emit greenhouse gas. We all ought not to emit greenhouse gas. I recommend you to meet this duty by reducing your emissions in the straightforward ways that we all know, and offsetting the rest of them in the way that you can do by employing an offsetting company to do it. When I say you ought not to emit any greenhouse gas, that is a very radical demand on us. But if you recognise that you can meet that demand by offsetting, which actually is extraordinarily cheap, it's not such a big demand, and I do think that all of us ought to do that. So I conclude that if we were all to act as morality requires us to act, we would emit no greenhouse gas. And of course the climate change problem would then be solved. So is that the way we should aim to solve the climate change problem? By getting everybody to fulfill their moral duty not to emit greenhouse gas. When I ask, should we do this, I'm employing this we in the generic sense. Should the community, the international community even, aim to deal with the climate change problem by encouraging people to satisfy their moral duty not to emit? There's one approach to dealing with climate change, but I think the answer to it is pretty obviously no. Some of my colleagues in philosophy do spend their time trying to encourage people to become moral, to adopt green virtues, but I think that's not a productive way of approaching the climate change problem, because people simply won't do it. If we're to deal with the climate change problem, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that there must be no emissions of greenhouse gas by the end of this century. 0 net emissions. We will have to get to that level. And that means that no one in the world can be emitting greenhouse gas, at least without making sure that it's offset by somebody else subtracting greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. So nearly all of us are going to have got ourselves into this position of zero emissions, and we can't achieve that. We can't get the message to everybody in the world that they should be doing that, and anyhow, even if we could, they wouldn't. So I think that the moral approach, or this particular moral approach, which is to try and get people to behave morally, is simply not a practical one for dealing with the problem of climate change. Compare it with another moral problem. It's immoral to drive very fast on the roads. You endanger people's lives when you do it. But we don't rely on morality to try and keep people within reasonable speeds when they drive on the roads. We don't spend our time preaching to people, don't drive fast on the roads. Instead, we have laws and we have speed cameras and stuff like that to force people not to drive fast. We employ the coercive power of the state to keep people under control on the roads. And dealing with climate change, I think, also requires the coercive power of the state. In one way or another, it's going to have to be governments that step in to prevent people from emitting greenhouse gas by regulation, or more gently to persuade people not to emit greenhouse gas by making it very expensive for them to do so. So if we're to deal with climate change, we need governments to act. I don't think anybody much would disagree with that. So what should we expect of governments? Again, we could ask for a moral response from governments. Governments have moral duties just as individuals have moral duties. I told you that the moral duty for us as individuals is not to emit greenhouse gas. Same applies to governments. Governments should not be emitting greenhouse gas. And actually governments can respond to their moral duties. I think that's been demonstrated by what has gone on in the last 25 years in international negotiations. At the recent COP meeting in Paris, governments showed up with offers to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Not offers on the scale that we need them, but they were genuine offers. And it's even true that some governments actually are doing things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Why do you do that? Well, why do they do that? I think, at any rate, if we're to be charitable in our interpretation of governments, we could think, well, they're doing it out of moral motivation. It's not in the direct interest of any individual government to reduce its nation's, its people's greenhouse gas emissions. When people in a country emit the greenhouse gas, they're getting benefit from it, and that benefit mostly comes to the people in the country. They're using the greenhouse gas to produce energy, which they then benefit from in some way. So they're getting benefit from it. They're also doing harm as a result of their emissions, but the harm generally falls on other people. It doesn't fall on the country that's doing the emissions. So each country individually benefits from emitting greenhouse gas. It has no motive of self-interest to reduce its own emissions, and yet we do find that countries are actually doing that. Now, there could be all sorts of motives underlying it, but if we're to look on them generously, I think we should recognise that moral motivations do have some effect on countries. They are willing to impose some constraints on their citizens for moral reasons. So I think we should accept that nations can be motivated by morality, and furthermore, we can help them with that. Why, insofar as they are motivated that way, are they? Well, it's presumably as a result of pressure from their citizens. This is something else that we can do as citizens that can have an effect on what happens to global emissions. We can't as individuals do very much, because when we reduce our own emissions, well, not many of us do it, and the result is that not much has changed. But in reducing our emissions, we also have an indirect effect, and that is by demonstrating that we care. And that has a political effect that goes far beyond the reduction of our own emissions. If you show that you care, other people can pick that up, and governments can begin to see that perhaps they should be doing something about it in order to please their citizens. And I suspect actually that out of individual action, that is the most effective thing we can do. Individual political action to influence our own governments is more powerful than simply reducing our own emissions. So we can do stuff through the morality of governments by getting our governments to behave properly. So should we use that as our way of controlling climate change? Is that what we should be doing? Should we be using whatever resources we can muster to persuade governments to behave morally? Well, in effect, that's what's been going on for the last 2.5 decades. During all the international negotiation since the Rio summit, countries have come together each year and they exhort each other, and people exhort them to do something about climate change, just to get on and at least do something to reduce these emissions. So we have been trying this for a long time, and I think the results show that it's not good enough. Countries will respond, and they did respond at the latest meeting in Paris. They did offer to reduce emissions. We know that they didn't offer enough, that the total of what they offered to do is far, far short of what needs to be done. And we also know that many of them are actually not going to do it. The British government, for instance, within a week of the Paris meeting, took away several of the controls that were aimed to reduce our emissions, climate change. It went ahead with fracking, for example. I've noticed there are some anti-frackers here. So obviously the British government is not going to do it. It looks as if the American government may be prevented from doing anything by the Supreme Court. So a lot of it is not going to happen. And I just think it's not a realistic prospect that governments out of moral motives are going to do enough to deal with the problem of climate change. I think the attempt to get them to do it has been tried for long enough, and it's pretty clear that it's going to fail. So we need a different approach. Don't do it by morality. Look for an alternative. Now, I think it's quite commonly assumed that it has to be by morality, because dealing with climate change requires a sacrifice from the present generation. This is how the problem has been presented to us for a long time. That we're doing harm to future generations by our emissions. We're doing the emissions because we benefit from them, but really we shouldn't do this because of the harm we're doing to future generations. So on straightforward moral grounds we shouldn't do it. And that's thought to be necessary as the only way that we can deal with the problem of climate change. A lot of the international negotiations were described as negotiations about so-called burden sharing. The nations met together in the various COP meetings to try and share out the burden of doing something about climate change among themselves. So we've got used to thinking that we have to make a sacrifice and take on the burden for the sake of future generations. But actually that isn't so, and it can be shown not to be so by a simple piece of economics. Greenhouse gas is what economists call an externality. So when you're making a decision involving emitting greenhouse gas, when you're deciding whether or not to do something that causes emissions, taking a flight or something like that, as we generally do when we take decisions, we weigh up the pros and cons, the benefits of doing it against the costs of doing it. And if you're going to take this flight, well, you have to pay money to do it. That's a cost, but there's a benefit because you get to where you're wanting to go. But you don't bear all of the costs of what you do. Some of the costs are the harm done by the emissions of greenhouse gas, and you don't bear those costs. Those are paid by the people around the world who are hurt by your greenhouse gas. They're what economists call external costs. They're external to the decision maker. The decision maker doesn't bear them. And those who emit greenhouse gas generally ignore this cost. Either they don't know about it or they don't care about it. So in our decision making, we generally don't correctly balance the costs of what we do against the benefits, because we don't take account of a lot of the costs. And that's what happens when you have an externality. And the result, as economics shows us, is that we end up emitting more greenhouse gas than is efficient in the technical sense of economists. In economics, the situation is called inefficient. When a change can be made that's better for some people and worse for no people. That's to say, this is called a Pareto improvement. A Pareto improvement is a change that's better for some people and worse for no one. And if the situation is inefficient, that means that a Pareto improvement is possible. It's possible to make some people better off without making anyone worse off. And economics tells us that when there is an externality, that will be the result, inefficiency. There's just one or two exceptions, and I'll mention one of those in a moment. So because greenhouse gas is an externality, it creates inefficiency. That's the elementary point about from economics. So that means it would be possible to eliminate this inefficiency that's done by greenhouse gas without anybody making a sacrifice. No sacrifice is required. The present generation does not need to make a sacrifice in order to deal with this problem of greenhouse gas. As a matter of fact, if any of you are coming to a talk I'm doing tomorrow, at that talk I will raise a problem about what I just said, but for the moment I'm just going to say it and not bother you with the difficulties of it. It is broadly correct, I think, even though there's some slight problem with it. People are so used to thinking that a sacrifice is required that that claim I just made, that it isn't required, often comes as a surprise, and I'm going to have to spend a bit of time explaining it. I think an analogy is helpful. So imagine two islands, inhabited islands. There's Windward Island and Leeward Island. And suppose that the Windward Islands have some industry. They make something for themselves, and smoke comes billowing out of their chimneys, and it blows down to Leeward Island, where it causes smog and harm. So it's an externality. The Windward Islanders have an externality. The smog is there is an external cost. The Windward Islanders you can think of as analogous to the present generation. The Leeward Islanders, who bear the cost of the smog, you can think of as analogous to future generations, and the smog is analogous to greenhouse gas. So here's a picture of an externality, which I've tried to set up as parallel to what we've got, and it will be inefficient. It would be possible in this situation to benefit some people without harming anybody. How could that happen? Well, the Leeward Islanders could pay a small fee to the Windward Islanders to get them to reduce their emissions. Because the Leeward Islanders are being harmed by this emission, they would be willing to pay some small fee. It would be worth their while to pay a little bit of money to do it. And because the Windward Islanders have been emitting smog costlessly, it costs them nothing to emit the smog, they've been freely emitting smog, it would be extremely cheap for them to reduce their emissions by a little bit, because they've just been doing them perfectly freely. So they would be willing to accept this small fee in order to reduce their emissions. So if the fee was paid by the Leeward Islanders to the Windward Islanders, there would be less to reduce emissions. The outcome would be less emissions, which is beneficial for both the Windward Islanders, because they're paid for it, and the Leeward Islanders, because they get less emissions and they're willing to pay for that. There's the analogy with the generations, or at any rate that's what I'm setting it up as. So how does this analogy run with the generations? Well, I hope you've already seen that there's a pretty obvious flaw in the analogy, because future generations can't pay a fee to earlier generations in order to get them to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gas. the Pareto improvement that I've described for the islanders was made possible by a fee going from Leeward Island to Windward Island, but a fee cannot come from future generations back to us, so it looks as if actually we're in a position which cannot, where a Pareto improvement cannot be achieved by paying a fee. In fact, if you imagine that no fee could be paid by Leeward Islanders to Windward Islanders, so as to improve the analogy, you would see that actually we would end up with a situation where there was still an externality. The smoke is still going from Windward Island to Leeward Island, but no Pareto improvement is possible because the compensation that would be needed from the Leeward Islanders to the Windward Islanders can't be paid. Imagine, for instance, that the wind blows so strongly from Windward Island to Leeward Island that the Leeward Island just cannot send anything up to windward to compensate the Windward Islanders. You might think that situation is more analogous to the one between generations, where later generations cannot pass money back to, or anything back to earlier generations to persuade them to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gas. But now let me extend the analogy a little bit more. So now, the situation is that the wind blows so hard that Leeward Islanders can't say anything to Windward Islanders. But suppose that just as a matter of practice, maybe they're generous people or they feel guilty because they're causing smog to the Leeward Islanders, it's the practice of the Windward Islanders to send nice gifts downwind, floating down on the wind to Leeward Islanders. So they're passing down, as well as disgusting smog, they're passing down nice things as well. Now the situation is once more inefficient and a Pareto improvement is possible. Not by the Leeward Islanders sending anything up to Windward Island, but by the Windward Islanders not sending so much down to Leeward Islanders. They could reduce their emissions in the way that benefits Leeward Islanders and pay themselves for doing it by reducing the nice goods that they send down to the Leeward Islanders. So they could make themselves better off by reducing emissions and also reducing the good things that they send down. And they could do it in a way that's also beneficial to Leeward Islanders, because although they'll be receiving fewer of the nice gifts, they will also be receiving less smog. So they could be better off on balance too. So here is an example where even though nothing can be passed from Leeward Island back to Windward Islands, even so a Pareto improvement is possible, managed by the Windward Islanders. Without the Leeward Islanders doing anything, the Windward Islanders can achieve a Pareto improvement in the way that I've described. And our intergenerational situation is analogous to that. I've by now extended the analogy to the point where it really does match quite well the intergenerational situation. Because we do regularly send gifts down to future generations. We do that by leaving them good things. We leave them plenty of good things. For one thing, we leave them the ordinary capital resources that we build when we invest in the economy. We leave them roads, we leave them cities, buildings to live in, improved agricultural resources, and so on. Lots of capital resources get passed from we, the present generation, down to the future generation. And also, we don't use up all the resources that are in the ground. Even when we've plundered the earth as much as we feel like doing, there will still be some resources left which have been passed on down to future generations. So we could do something analogous to what the Windward Islanders do. We could reduce our emissions of greenhouse gas, which, other things being equal, would be a cost to us, but we could compensate ourselves for doing that by leaving future generations less of the nice stuff that we leave them. So don't leave them so much conventional capital, the roads and things like that. Instead, leave them a cleaner atmosphere. And if we do that properly, they will be better off as a result. And we can also do this in a way that's leaves us better off too, because we can fully compensate ourselves for the costs of cleaning up the atmosphere by reducing conventional investments. This is really just a matter of switching our investments. At the moment we do conventional investment, which leaves useful stuff to future generations, but just switch it a bit from the conventional investment to green investment, to building solar panels, wind farms, insulating houses and so on. All of this is investment which cleans up the atmosphere for future generations. This is a way to put it in macroeconomic terms. When we produce goods, they get divided between consumption, which are the goods that we use to give ourselves a nice life, and investment, which is what we put back into the productive system so as to produce more goods in the future. And what we need to do is switch the part that we put into investment away from the way we usually do it, which is roads and machinery and stuff, switch it away from there to green investment, which is insulation and solar panels. And we can do that whilst keeping our consumption the same. We don't have to take anything out of consumption. We can hang on to the consumption that we've got. Of course, we're going to have to change the particular goods that we consume. We're not going to be able to consume very energy-intensive goods or very carbon-intensive goods when we do that. We're going to have to consume different sorts of goods, ones that are not so demanding in carbon. But we can do it in a way that leaves us no worse off. So our aggregate consumption we can keep at the same level, even while we are reducing the amount of greenhouse gas that we send down to future generations. So it really is true that the present generation does not need to make a sacrifice in order to deal with this problem of climate change. So we don't have to appeal to anyone's morality in order to do it. Dealing with climate change, getting rid of this externality that I've been talking about, will produce a huge benefit for people in the world. And this benefit can be distributed amongst the generations in such a way as to leave none of them worse off. That's the way to look at it. Amongst the generations and also amongst the people in the world, in a way that leaves none of them, among the current generation, in a way that leaves none of them any worse off. No one in any generation needs to suffer. There really is an opportunity for Pareto improvement. Now, I'm going to talk in a bit about practical means of making this possible. But before we get to practical means, there's some moral issues to think about. Because just because a Pareto improvement is possible, and I've been saying that it really is, it doesn't follow from that we should aim for a Pareto improvement. There are things to be said against doing that, and I'm now going to talk about those objections to doing it. Climate change, as well as causing the inefficiency that I've been describing, does other bad things as well. For one thing, it's a great injustice. There's a big injustice because we, the rich, are by and large the people who emit the greenhouse gas. The people who suffer the harm of greenhouse gas are by and large the poor people of this world. So we are harming the poor in the world, and that's clearly an injustice. So that's one thing we need to think about. And another thing we need to think about is the global maldistribution that there is in the world, the gross inequality that there is, which I'm going to call maldistribution. That's certainly to some extent increased by greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a bad thing that climate change is doing, and it's something else that we should think about. And we should think about them because a Pareto improvement, which I've just been saying is possible, would do nothing or very little to correct either of those bad results of climate change. It would do nothing to improve the to get rid of the injustice, or at any rate, it wouldn't get rid of the injustice. And it also would not do very much or could not do very much to improve the maldistribution in the world. So those are two objections. If we go for a Pareto improvement, we are not doing anything about injustice, and we're not doing anything about maldistribution, and perhaps we should. So let me take those in turn. So injustice. Now let me just make it clear what this injustice is that I'm talking about. So suppose that every night you play loud music on your sound system, and it keeps your neighbour awake night after night. So you're doing harm to her. She can't sleep. Well, now, suppose your neighbour pays you to stop doing it. That might be a Pareto improvement. She might find it worth her while to pay you to stop emitting all this loud music, because at least she gets to sleep. She's willing to pay the cost for that. And you take the money, and you might be very happy to have the money in exchange for not playing the loud music so much. You might like the money a lot. So it's a Pareto improvement, or it could be a Pareto improvement if the quantities were correct. Nevertheless, it doesn't correct the injustice. It was unjust in the first place that you were harming your neighbour by all this loud music, and the Pareto improvement doesn't correct the injustice. In fact, it embeds the injustice. It perpetuates it in another form. And in the same way, the Pareto improvement I've described as a way of dealing with climate change doesn't or needn't correct injustice between people. We, the people who emit greenhouse gas, do harm to other people. That's unjust. A Pareto improvement could be achieved by those other people paying us to reduce our emissions, and that would be a Pareto improvement, better for them, because they don't have to suffer the greenhouse gas, better for us because we're being paid to reduce our emissions. But it wouldn't stop it being unjust. It was unjust in the first place that we were doing the emissions. And if they have to pay us, that certainly doesn't get rid of the injustice. It seems as if it will increase the injustice. After all, the rich countries, you might well think, already owe the poor countries compensation for the large amount of harm that they've already done them as a result of their greenhouse gas emissions. And if now the poor countries was to start paying the rich countries to reduce their emissions, that would simply augment the injustice that we've got. Now, what's the response to that? Well, we have to recognise that there really is an injustice, and a Pareto improvement will not correct it. But this problem is mainly a problem between contemporaries. It's an intra-generational injustice rather than intergenerational injustice. I don't think that greenhouse gas emissions do actually a large injustice to future generations. There are various reasons for that. I'm going to mention just one, which is by no means a conclusive argument. But at any rate, I hope will indicate to you that you can't simply assume that when our greenhouse gas emissions, we are doing harm to future generations. There are I think more significant technical reasons, but I'm not going to trouble you with those. I will just give you this one, which is certainly not conclusive. Think of the islands again. The Windward Islanders are doing an injustice to the Leeward Islanders by the smog that they impose on them. But when they send nice things down to them, they are to some extent compensating for the injustice that they do. And compensating people for injustice is, in many cases, a way of reducing the injustice. Indeed, it sometimes is enough if you can produce adequate compensation, you can fully cancel out the injustice that you do. And we're doing something similar to future generations, as I've said. We are sending gifts down to the future generations at the same time as we send pollution down to them. And there is even some case to be made for saying that we are fully compensating them for the harm that we're doing them by our emissions. Because if we believe the economic models, they say, in most cases, that future people are going to be better off than we are. So they're going to be better off than we are, even despite the smog, I shouldn't say smog, despite the pollution that we're sending them. How could they be better off than us? Well, because of our investment, because of the capital that we leave them, they are able to live better than we are. So there's a case for saying that the good things that we pass down are in aggregate sufficient compensation for the bad thing that we pass down in the way of pollution. Now, there's an objection to that, which is that compensation really needs to go to particular individuals, and this probably doesn't go to particular individuals. But at any rate, there is something to set against the idea that we are doing injustice to future generations. And I think we are not actually doing much of an injustice to future generations for that reason and others too. But there is, of course, a genuine injustice going on among contemporaries within the present generations. If the poor had to compensate us for reducing our emissions, that would be perpetuating a terrible injustice that we are already doing them. But I don't think that needs to be what happens. Remember, there is a great benefit to be achieved by reducing this externality, and the main beneficiaries will be future generations. And in effect, those future generations can compensate the present generation for what we're doing. And so far as I can see, there's nothing that says that the amount of compensation that's available couldn't be used to compensate the present poor fully for the harm that's been done. In effect, this would be compensation paid not by the present rich to the present poor, but by the future rich to the present poor. So it isn't clear that compensation would not, adequate compensation, enough to cancel out the injustice, would not be possible. So if there is a problem of injustice, at any rate it can be mitigated by an appropriate distribution of the benefits that come from cancelling out the externality. That's one of the problems. The next problem is maldistribution. Now you might think, well, isn't that injustice? Because people often speak of what I'm calling maldistribution as distributional injustice. And I don't mind you're using that term, but you need to realise that the distributional injustice, if you want to call it that, is not the same as the injustice that I've been talking about. And you can see that again by thinking of the analogy. The Windward Islanders do harm to the Leeward Islanders, and that's an injustice that they do them, and it needs compensation. But the Leeward Islanders might be much better off than the Windward Islanders. I never said they weren't. They might be much better off. Suppose they are better off. In that case, the industry of the Windward Islanders, which does harm to the Leeward Islanders, may actually be improving the distribution of income between the islands. It's making the Windward Islanders better off because they're gaining from their industry. It's making the Leeward Islanders worse off because they're suffering the smog. But this may actually, from the point of view of distribution, may be an improvement because equality, we think of, is a good thing. So the issue of maldistribution is not the same as the issue of injustice that I talked about. And what actually is the position with climate change? Well, first of all, among contemporaries, there is very great maldistribution. We live in a world where the inequality of wealth and income is huge and totally unjustifiable. And furthermore, greenhouse gas does contribute to that, because by and large, as I said, the emitters are the rich and the people who suffer are the poor. So climate change is actually contributing to the maldistribution in the world. However, it's not a major source of the maldistribution that we've got. The maldistribution we've got is the result of colonialism over hundreds of years and very unequal economic growth, possibly caused by colonialism, in different parts of the world. That's what's caused, those are the major sources of the maldistribution we've got. Climate change has only been having an effect within the last few decades, and that's far too late for it to be a major part of the maldistribution we've got. So it does contribute to maldistribution within the generation, but not on a huge scale. What about intergenerational maldistribution? Well, now this is where that diagram that I put on the handout might help you if you're used to economist diagrams. If you're not, it probably won't help you. And I'm afraid I'm not going to take time explaining it to you. I'm not going to talk through the diagram. I'm going to talk apart from the diagram, but you might be able to guide yourself through it if you want to. Well, I've already told you that common opinion amongst economists is that future people will be better off than us. And greenhouse gas, the emission, benefits us and it harms future people. So you might think on the face of it, well, it's just like my last example of the islands. It's actually improving the distribution of income intergenerationally rather than adding to maldistribution. Because surely intergenerational inequality is a bad thing, just like any other sort of inequality. So you might at first think, oh well, that's straightforward. Intergenerationally, there is no problem of maldistribution to worry about. But actually, that would be a mistake. Because when you think about distribution of income and resources, equality is not the only thing that matters. The total amount of people's income or well-being matters, as well as equality. Obviously, we don't just care about having people well-being or income equally distributed across the world. We also care about having people better off. That's to say, improving their income. And that means there is something to be said for delaying consumption of goods. We possess an economy that you could call productive, in that if you put goods into the economy, more comes out. So feeding goods of one sort or another in, inputs, capital goods and so on, put some goods in, they turn into greater quantities of goods when they come out. And that means delaying consumption is a way of leading to more consumption in the future. If we reduce our own consumption, so we feed the goods that we produce back into the economy to produce goods in the future, they'll produce more goods in the future. So delaying consumption is a way of increasing total consumption, presumably total well-being overall. So actually, when you think about distribution, there is something to be said for having future people better off than us. You get more benefit altogether by passing economic consumption down through the generations. So it does make things less equal, but on the other hand, it increases the overall consumption. And those are two things that need to be balanced against each other. And there are economists who do that. And their conclusions appear on the diagram that you've got. Economists do cost-benefit analysis of climate change, and they try and figure out what would be the best distribution of consumption or resources between the present generation and the future generations. Two prominent economists who've done this is Nick Stern, and another is William Nordhaus. Both of them have done cost-benefit analysis of this problem, and both of them have reached the conclusion that if we're going to do the very best thing, make the distribution between generations the very best one, that means the present generation should consume less than it's actually consuming. That's to say, both of those economists are in favour of the present generation making a sacrifice. And that appears on the diagram, if you're experienced enough in economic diagrams to be able to read them. So both of them think that the present generation should make a sacrifice. Now, I said the present generation doesn't have to make a sacrifice. We can do a Pareto improvement without making a sacrifice. But those economists, who are pretty representative, think that actually the present generation should make a sacrifice. That's because of appropriate distribution between present and future generations. So there's a second case against the Pareto improvement that I'm recommending. But I'm against it. I don't think that argument has enough weight to counter the what can be achieved by a Pareto improvement. And that's because what I said from the beginning, it's not going to work. It relies on people acting morally, on the present generation making a sacrifice, which would have to be on moral grounds, to benefit generations in the future. That's in fact what Stern and Nordhaus are calling for. Because they think the best result involves our making a sacrifice, they're calling for us to make a sacrifice. And I suspect that's probably why the international negotiations have seen things the same way. The negotiators have thought, well, we've got to make a sacrifice, or we should make a sacrifice, and so we've got to divide it up among the nations. But I don't think that's going to be achieved. To do what Stern and Nordhaus want involves the present generation giving up on some of its well-being and passing resources down to the future. That may be the best thing that could happen. That may even be what, in some sense or other, we ought to do, but we're not going to do it. And I think to continue to try and do it is going to block what we can do. It's making the best, which involves a sacrifice, the enemy of the good, which is to make a Pareto improvement that improves the position of everybody. The world faces many problems. One of them is climate change. Another one is maldistribution of well-being. And both of them are appallingly hard problems to solve. But if we continue to aim for the best outcome that Stern and Nordhaus have identified, we are in effect dumping onto the problem of climate change the further problem of solving the maldistribution of income and well-being. We're trying to solve both the problems together, and what that means, in effect, since we're working on climate change, is that the problem of dealing with both of them is being dumped onto the climate change negotiations and the decisions about climate change that we're making. Aiming for the best, I think, is weighing down the international negotiations in a way that means that they're not going to succeed. If climate change were largely responsible for the maldistribution, I think that might be the right thing to do, but it isn't. I said it is contributing to maldistribution intragenerationally, but it isn't the main contributor to that. Maldistribution arises from a long history, and climate change has relatively little to do with it. So it seems to me that we should separate the problems of maldistribution and climate change. Climate change is very urgent. We should do that, and we should also, of course, deal with maldistribution, but I think we should treat that as a separate problem. It requires a moral response. We can't fix maldistribution without the rich giving up their privileges to some extent for the poor. So that really does require a moral response. But fixing climate change, I think, doesn't. We can do the thing that demands only promoting self-interest, which is to look for a Pareto improvement. I think we should abandon the high-minded approach to climate change, the moral one, in favour of self-interest. Now, if I may, can I spend 5 minutes on how to actually go about doing that? Is that okay? So I think that's what we should do. And I said I think that will make the negotiations go easier. If we start talking about how to distribute among the nations the benefits of dealing with climate change, rather than how to distribute among the nations the burdens of dealing with climate change, well, I think that will just make things look rosier, and I hope that things will go more smoothly. Doesn't mean everything's going to be easy as a result of that. There are at least 3 problems. So switching the focus towards self-interest leaves us with still 3 big problems. The first one is what's called the commons problem. As I said earlier, it's not in the interests of any nation to reduce its emissions, because the costs of doing the costs of emitting are borne by other people. The benefits of emitting come to the nation. So it's not in any individual's interest in doing that. And that will be so whatever arises from international negotiations. Even if there's an international agreement, it still will be in the interest of each nation to break it. What I've said is that it is possible to arrive to deal with climate change in a way that's beneficial for every nation. So if all the nations reduce their emissions, that will be beneficial to every nation. But it remains true that if an individual nation continues to emit more, that will be better for that individual nation. This is a prisoner's dilemma, or in this context, this is a situation which is more often called a commons problem. And it's difficult. It could only be solved by international cooperation. Nations will have to agree together to reduce their emissions, and then there has to be some mechanism which ensures that they're doing it. Not an easy thing to do. Particularly, it's not easy to think of how to enforce the whatever agreement is achieved. And even before that, there's a problem of achieving an agreement, because the nations have to agree what each individual nation is going to do by way of reducing its emissions. And that's really the second problem. It isn't inevitable that an agreement can be found, because it does involve distribution of income between the different nations. It will be beneficial to everybody, but even distributing benefits is obviously a matter of contention between different nations. So that's the second problem. The third problem is one of economics, which is how actually to implement the proposal that I've described, which is to shift investment away from conventional investment towards green investment. If we had a world government and it controlled investment in the world, it could just do it. If it actually decided how things were going to be invested, it could just switch its investment. So that would be a way of doing it. And that simple fact that it could be done if we had sufficient international control tells us this is not a problem. This is not a problem of real economics, as you might say. This is not a matter of the technology that's available for dealing with climate change or anything like that. This is just a matter of the economic system that we're living under. We're living under a capitalist system in which the decisions are not made by a government, they're made by capitalists. They decide how to do the investment. They will invest in the most profitable, take the most profitable investment opportunities, and those are not ones that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the problem, the economic problem, is how to get the capitalists, to incentivize the capitalists to reduce the investment in conventional stuff so as to shift the money towards green investment. How do we do that? Well, first of all, there's got to be a carbon price. I think all economists agree that we will never achieve what we're aiming to achieve without ensuring that people do actually pay for the cost of the carbon that they emit. This is called internalising the externality that I described. People have to pay, and we won't get anywhere if we don't have a carbon price. You know, so long as governments are going around saying, "Oh, we've got to keep the price of energy low," then we will not deal with climate change. Of course, the price of energy has to go up. That is inevitable if we're to deal with it. This can be achieved by a carbon tax or cap and trade or in some other way. And this will make green investment more attractive. So this will now give an incentive to capitalists to start moving in the direction of investing in green. But unfortunately, it isn't a Pareto improvement. If you impose a carbon tax, then people have to pay the carbon tax, and that costs them. So we're looking for a way that's beneficial to everybody. There has to be a carbon tax, but if you just impose a carbon tax or a carbon price, you will not be making things better for everybody. So what do you do to make things better for everybody? Well, you compensate them for paying the carbon tax. And there are ways of doing that. You can reduce their other taxation. In fact, many of the carbon taxes that we already have in the world, such as the one in British Columbia, are compensated in that way, or as far as they could be. They're revenue neutral, as it's put. All the money that comes in from the carbon tax is paid out again by reducing other taxes. And the idea is to make sure that people are not made worse off by redistributing the money. Now that's the idea, but unfortunately it won't work. Or we'd be very lucky if we could fully compensate for a carbon tax by distributing the revenue that comes in from the carbon tax by reducing other taxes. That cannot be expected to work. So actually the only way that people could be compensated for paying this carbon tax is by loans. Governments are going to have to raise loans, and they can use the money that they raise for loans to compensate people for paying the carbon tax. So how does that work in more detail? Well, they issue bonds, and they sell these bonds to the capitalists who otherwise were going to invest in conventional capital. So they put them on the market. They had to put them on a market at an interest rate that's sufficient to attract the capitalists out of their conventional investment to buy these bonds instead. So they're giving the capitalists another asset that they could hold instead of building machinery and stuff like that. They're giving them another asset. So they're selling the bonds to the capitalists. This gets money into the coffers of the government, which could then use it for compensating people for paying the greenhouse, the carbon tax, or alternatively directly for greenhouse gas investments if it wants to do it. So that's how the mechanism will have to work. Now you might think, well, that's hopeless because governments are not in a position of being able to borrow money anymore. There's this story got about that government debt cannot be increased, that there's enough public debt already and it isn't possible to increase it anymore. So this is a story you hear a lot in Europe. So European governments are doing their very best to reduce the government debt. They think they can't allow the government debt to increase. Now, in Europe, that's obviously false. I mean, governments in Europe at the moment can borrow money for peanuts. They can borrow money for virtually zero interest. So, of course, they can borrow money. That's not a problem as it stands at the moment. But there is a genuine problem, which is that if they're going to borrow for dealing with climate change, they're going to have to borrow for a long term. And there may well not be many governments that are powerful enough, stable enough, to convince investors to buy bonds that they issue, if, say, they're 50-year or 100-year bonds. So I think we need a new institution. Those bonds will have to be issued in order to finance the investment that we need to finance. Probably they can't be issued by governments on enough scale, so we need a new international bank that will be solid enough to provide a firm basis for the loans that will have to be issued. We need a World Climate Bank. We already have a World Bank and an IMF, institutions that were created to reconstruct the world after the Second World War. We need another one. And that will make it possible to deal with climate change in a way that doesn't ask a sacrifice from anybody. So I think we should give up in our international negotiations trying to make people make sacrifices. Instead, we should turn our attention to creating this international institution which will mean that we stand a chance of actually doing something about climate change.